It was 41 degrees and raining behind a gas station in Rockford, Illinois, when a 280-pound outlaw biker found a little girl sleeping inside a cardboard box. She was 8 years old. She had no shoes. And when he crouched in front of her, she didn't scream or try to run. She looked at the skull on his jacket and asked him one question. "Are you the one my mom said would come?" Raymond Volkov had hurt people. He had spent 11 years in a maximum security prison. He had a reputation that made grown men move out of his way. But that night he broke every rule he lived by and took the child home. 15 years later, she would walk into a federal courtroom and become the only person who could save his life. This is the story of a man the government called a criminal and a girl who called him something else. It's the story of a 15-year promise, a prosecutor who wanted a career, a detective who wanted a name, and a piece of evidence that had been sitting in a shoebox in a diner in Loves Park, Illinois, for a decade and a half, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Stay with me. Because what that young woman said on the stand in the 48th minute of that trial changed everything. And the reason she said it goes all the way back to a night in 2007 that neither of them ever talked about again. And tell me where you are watching from. I did love to hear from you. There are towns that die loudly. Rockford, Illinois was not one of them. Rockford died the way a man dies in his sleep. Slowly, without ceremony, and mostly without anybody in the next room noticing. In the 1950s, this was a city that made things. Screws and bolts and fasteners, machine tools. Furniture so well built that people still have it in their basements, still solid, still refusing to fall apart. There was a time when if you drove up Kishwaukee Street at 6 in the morning, you'd have to slow down for the shift change, because there were that many people walking through those factory gates. By the fall of 2007, you could drive that same road at 6 in the morning and not see a living soul. The factories were still standing. That's the part nobody tells you about a city like this. The buildings don't come down. Nobody has the money to knock them down. So they just stay there, block after block of them, with their windows punched out and their loading docks rusting, and grass coming up through the cracks in the parking lots where 4,000 cars used to sit. There's a church on South Main with plywood over the stained glass. Somebody spray-painted a word on it years ago, and nobody ever came to wash it off. And the paint faded before the plywood rotted, and now you can't read it anymore. Nobody remembers what it said. That's Rockford. Not a ruin, just a place that got left. And that autumn, the rain came in early and it came in cold. And it stayed for 11 straight days. And the whole city sat under a sky the color of dishwater and waited for it to be over. I need to tell you about a man now. And I need to tell you the truth about him. Because if I lie to you at the start of this, you will never trust me again. And you shouldn't. His name was Raymond Volkov. He was 52 years old. He was 6'3" and something in the neighborhood of 280 pounds. And he had hands like something you'd find at the bottom of a toolbox. And if you passed him on the sidewalk, you would move. You wouldn't decide to move. Your body would move you. The way your body moves you away from an open flame, before your brain has finished having an opinion about it. Everybody called him Grizz. Almost nobody called him Raymond. He was the sergeant-at-arms of the Rockford Charter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. And if you don't know what a sergeant-at-arms is, I'll tell you plainly. He was the man the club sent when the conversation was over. That was the job. That was the whole job. There is no gentle way to describe it, and I'm not going to invent one. He had done 11 years in Stateville Correctional Center, a maximum security prison in Crest Hill, Illinois. A place with a reputation so ugly that men who've been inside it don't tell stories about it. They just say the name and stop talking. 11 years. He went in a young man, and he came out with gray in his beard and a way of sitting with his back to the wall that he never lost. Not once, not for the rest of his life. What did he go in for? We'll get there, not yet. But I want you to sit with the fact that he went, and that it was a long time, and that it was not a mistake, and that he never once claimed it was. He had hurt people. That is not in dispute. It was not in dispute by the police, it was not in dispute by the courts, and it was not in dispute by Raymond Volkov, who in 52 years of life had never bothered to tell a lie about himself in either direction, not to make himself look better, and not to make himself look worse. He was, by any honest accounting, a dangerous man. Hold that. I'm serious. Hold on to that and don't put it down, because in about 10 minutes you are going to want to put it down. And if you do, if you let yourself forget it, then this story becomes a fairy tale, and it isn't one. It's better than a fairy tale. It's true, and true is harder, and true is worth more. So keep the weight of him in your hands, all of it. Now, here is the other thing about him. Every morning of his life, in the kitchen of a small brick house on the north side of Rockford, Raymond Volkov made coffee, and every morning of his life he set out 2 cups. His wife had been dead for 4 years. Her name was Nadia. She was a small woman. Everyone who talks about her says that first, that she was small, and that it never once seemed to occur to her that she was. And she'd been a school nurse in the Rockford district for 19 years. 19 years of scraped knees and forehead thermometers and kids who said their stomach hurt when what actually hurt was something else entirely, and she knew the difference. She always knew the difference, and she never once made a child feel stupid for lying to her about it. She married a man who other men were afraid of. She never seemed afraid of him for a minute. When she died, and she died the way ordinary people die, in an ordinary hospital room, with an ordinary illness that took its ordinary time about it, the men of that club, men with records as long as your arm, stood outside the funeral home in the rain because there wasn't room for all of them inside, and they took their hats off, and not one of them said a word. 4 years later, her reading glasses were still on the windowsill over the kitchen sink, folded, right where she'd left them. He never moved them. He washed the dishes around them, and he set out 2 cups. Remember that. That's all I'll say. Remember the 2 cups. There was one man in that world who could tell Raymond Volkov the truth to his face, and his name was Hugo Delacroix, and everybody called him Psalm. Nobody's entirely sure where the name came from. The story most people tell is that he'd been raised by a grandmother who made him memorize scripture, and that 30 years and a hard life later, he could still, if you got 2 drinks into him, recite whole passages of it in a low, steady voice like a man reading a weather report. He was the road captain, the one who planned the runs, the one who knew every back road in 3 counties, the one who could look at a map for 6 seconds and tell you exactly where the state police would be sitting. Psalm was the club's conscience, insofar as it had one, and he was the only man alive who'd ever told Grizz he was wrong, and lived to tell it twice. There was a thing Grizz used to say. He said it constantly. He said it so often that it had become a running joke, the kind of joke a group of men makes about a man they'd walk into fire for. Somebody'd leave a wrench out in the yard overnight, and half the clubhouse would say it in unison before Grizz could get his mouth open. You don't leave what's yours out in the cold. That's it. That's the whole line. He never explained it. Nobody ever asked him to, because it seemed obvious. It seemed like a thing about tools, or bikes, or maybe about loyalty in that broad, chest-thumping way that men in clubs like that talk about loyalty. It seemed like nothing. Nobody in that room knew where he got it. Nobody knew what it meant. Neither did he. Not yet. I want you to write that sentence down somewhere, if you're the kind of person who does that. You don't leave what's yours out in the cold, because it is going to come back 3 times before this is over, and the 3rd time is going to take the floor out from under you. It was the 21st of October, and it was 41 degrees, and it was raining. Not the good kind. Not the kind of rain that comes down hard and gets it over with. This was the other kind, the fine, mean, endless kind. The kind that doesn't fall so much as hang there, so that walking through it feels less like getting rained on, and more like being slowly, patiently soaked by the air itself. The temperature was just high enough that it wouldn't freeze, and just low enough that it would take everything out of you. Grizz was riding back from a run. 4 hours in that weather. He'd stopped being cold about 90 minutes earlier, which anybody who rides will tell you is not a good sign. And he pulled into a marathon station on Kishwaukee Street, a little after 9 at night, with his hands so stiff he had to work them open and closed a few times before he could get the fuel cap off. The station was mostly dark. One of the overhead lights was out, and another one was doing that thing where it can't decide, buzzing and flickering, throwing the whole lot into a stutter. There was nobody at the other pumps. There was nobody, as far as he could tell, anywhere in a quarter mile. He was standing there with the pump running when he heard it. A sound from behind the dumpster at the far edge of the lot. Small, wet. It came once and then it stopped. An animal, he figured. A raccoon or a stray or something that had crawled in out of the weather, which is what animals do, and which is the only sensible thing a living creature can do on a night like that. He didn't think about it again for maybe 40 seconds. Then it came a second time, and it was not an animal. I've thought a long time about how to tell you what he found back there, because I want to be careful with it. I want to be careful with her. She was 8 years old. She was sitting inside a cardboard box that had been broken down flat and then folded back up into a rough kind of shelter, wedged into the gap between the dumpster and the cinder block wall, in the one spot in that entire lot where the wind couldn't reach. Which tells you something. That's not luck. A child who finds the one dry corner on a night like that is a child who has had to learn things. She had no shoes. Beside her was a black plastic garbage bag, twisted shut at the top, and inside that bag was everything she owned in the world. 2 shirts. A hairbrush with a broken handle, snapped clean off, so that you'd have to hold it by the bristle's end to use it. And a photograph. That's it. That's the inventory. 2 shirts, a hairbrush, and a photograph. Now, everything I know about that little girl, and by the end of this hour you're going to know a great deal about her, tells me that she should have run. She had spent a long time by then learning exactly one lesson, and the lesson was that when a grown person you don't know comes toward you in the dark, you get up and you go, and you don't stop and you don't look back and you don't ever let them get close enough to put a hand on you. She'd run from everybody. She would have run from a mailman. She would have run from a nun, and here came the single most frightening human being in Winnebago County, Illinois. 280 pounds of him, in a wet leather cut with a death's head stitched across the back, boots ringing on the asphalt, rain coming down his beard, blocking out what little light there was, and he crouched down in front of that box. And she looked at him, and she did not run. She looked up at the patch on his chest, and she looked at his face, and something went across her own face that he would spend the next 15 years trying to find a word for, and never quite manage it. It wasn't fear. It wasn't relief either. Not exactly. It was recognition. And then that little girl asked him a question. 6 words, and in the 11 days of federal trial that this story is walking toward, in 400 pages of testimony and 9 photographs and a signed confession, there is not one sentence spoken by anybody that matters more than these 6 words. She said, "Are you the one my mom said would come?" Raymond Volkov had never seen that child before in his life. He had never seen her mother. He did not know her name. He did not know where she'd come from or how long she'd been out there, or what had happened to put her behind a dumpster on Kishwaukee Street, in the cold, with a garbage bag and no shoes. He knew nothing. He was, in that moment, the least informed man in the state of Illinois. He knelt there in 3 inches of standing water, and his knees were killing him, and the rain was running off the back of his neck and down inside his collar, and he understood with total and immediate clarity exactly how this was going to go if he did the thing he was already thinking about doing. He had a felony record, a serious one, an old one, the kind that follows a man into every room he will ever enter for the rest of his life. He had a club with rules, and the rules were not suggestions, and one of the oldest of them was that you do not bring the outside world through that door. Not your problems, not your family, not a stranger, not ever. He had a house on the north side with a kitchen that hadn't had a child in it in 30 years, and a windowsill with a dead woman's glasses on it, and 2 coffee cups on the counter, one of which he washed every morning for no reason at all. He was going to say no. I want to be clear about this, because this is the part people get wrong when they tell this story secondhand. They tell it like he scooped her up out of the rain and rode off into the night, and that was that. It wasn't. He was going to say no. He had every reason in the world to say no, and not one single reason to say anything else, and he opened his mouth to say it. And then he looked down at the photograph in her hand. She was holding it, not in the bag with the rest of it, in her hand, out in the weather, where it was getting ruined. She'd been holding it long enough and hard enough that it was creased through the middle in a deep white line, and the face at the center of it was worn so thin you could barely make it out anymore. Whatever was in that picture, she had looked at it so many times that she had almost rubbed it out of existence. He looked at it for maybe 4 seconds. He never told anybody what he saw. Not his lawyer, not Psalm, not the girl herself, not once, not in 15 years. And then Raymond Volkov opened his mouth, and he said something else. There is a public library on North Wyman Street in Rockford, a squat municipal building the color of wet sand. And in the spring of 2008, the woman working the reference desk on Tuesday afternoons watched a 280-pound man in a leather cut come through the doors for the fourth week in a row. She'd been nervous the first time. She admitted that later, freely, without embarrassment. She said anybody would have been. But by the fourth week, she wasn't nervous anymore. She was just curious, because the man never went near the newspapers, or the computers, or any of the places she'd have expected. He went to the same section every time, 646, sewing, needlework, personal appearance. And on that fourth Tuesday, she finally worked up the nerve to walk over and ask him if he needed help finding something. He didn't look up. He said, "No, ma'am." Then, after a long pause, in the voice of a man confessing to a crime, "It's the French one. There's a French one, and there's a regular one, and I can do the regular one." She stood there for a second, and then, very carefully, she said, "You mean a French braid?" And Raymond Volkov said, "That's the one." Here's what I want you to understand about that. There were, at that time, at least a dozen women within a mile of his house who would have shown him how to do it in 90 seconds. There was a woman 2 doors down. There was the wife of a man in his own club. There was the girl at the diner across from the marathon station who'd known him for 20 years. He would not ask, not because he was proud exactly. It was something worse than pride and better than pride at the same time. It was that if he asked a woman to teach him how to braid that child's hair, then he would have to say the words "my daughter," or "the girl," or "the one who's living with me now," and he would have to hear how those words sounded coming out of his own mouth, and he was not ready. So instead, he checked out a library book, and then another one, and he sat on the edge of a bed in a spare room in a brick house on the north side of Rockford, a man whose knuckles had been broken and reset more times than he could count, with a book open on his knee and a diagram in it made of neat little dotted arrows, and he practiced. He was terrible at it. Catastrophically terrible. He had hands built for other work entirely, and he could not, for the life of him, keep 3 strands separate. The child sat there with the patience of a small saint, and once, she made the mistake of laughing, and he stopped, and he looked at her in the mirror, and she froze. And then he laughed too, and it was the first time she'd heard it. It took him 11 days, and on the 11th day, he got it right. A real one, tight and even and clean all the way down. And he stood back from it and looked at it in the mirror, like a man looking at a bridge he'd built with his own 2 hands. And she wore it to school, and she did not take it out for 3 days. Her name was Wren. That was the only name anybody had for a long time. No last name, nothing on paper, just Wren, like a bird, like something small enough to sit on a wire and watch a whole city go by and not be noticed by any of it. And that club, that charter, in a cinder block building on the south end with a steel door and no windows to speak of, bent itself around her. Not all at once. It wasn't a movie. There was no scene where 16 hard men suddenly decided to be soft. What happened was slower and, honestly, stranger. What happened was that a group of men who had spent their entire adult lives building a world with no children in it began, without discussing it, to make room. Hugo Delacroix, Psalm, was the one who taught her to read a map, not a phone, a map, paper. He'd unfold one across a table with a beer and a ballpoint pen, and he'd say, "All right, we're here, and we need to get there, and the interstate's a fool's road, so we're not taking it. Now show me." And she'd trace it with one finger, county road to county road, and she'd get it wrong, and he'd say nothing at all, he'd just wait, and she'd try again. He never once told her the answer, not one time in 7 years. Years later, a lawyer would ask her where she learned to think the way she thinks, and she'd say, "A man named Psalm taught me that there's always another road, and the road they expect you to take is usually the wrong one." And then there was the bookshelf. She got a bookshelf that first winter. It appeared, that's the only word for it. Nobody carried it in, nobody announced it. It was simply there one Saturday morning against the wall of that spare room. A real one. Solid oak, hand-planed, 6 shelves, sanded so smooth you couldn't find a splinter on it if you dragged your palm across the whole thing. Grizz asked around. Nobody knew a thing about it. Every man in that clubhouse looked him in the eye and said he had no idea where it came from. But there was one man who couldn't quite look him in the eye. His name was Cormac Reyes, and everybody called him Tin. And Tin, you'll remember, was the man who had stood up in that room on the night of the vote and argued against her, loudly, angrily, for the better part of an hour. He'd said it was insane. He'd said it would bring the state down on all of them. He'd said, and I'm quoting the man who was sitting next to him, "You are going to get us all killed over a kid who isn't yours." And then, apparently, he'd gone home to his garage, and he'd spent about 6 weeks of evenings building an 8-year-old girl a bookshelf, and he never admitted it, and he never would. Hold on to Tin. I'm going to ask you to hold on to a lot of things today, and I know it's a lot. But hold on to him. Hold on to the man who voted no and built the shelf. In October of 2008, Raymond Volkov attended a parent-teacher conference. I want you to picture the physical reality of this, because it's the only funny thing in this entire story, and we're going to need it later. The teacher had a small classroom on the second floor of an elementary school on the east side, and she had arranged, as teachers do, 2 chairs on the parent's side of her desk. Child-sized chairs, molded plastic, 12 inches off the floor. And into that room came a man the size of a refrigerator, in a leather cut with a death's head on the back, with a beard down to his chest. And he looked at the chair, and he looked at the teacher, and he looked back at the chair, and then he sat down in it. He didn't complain, he didn't ask for a different one. He folded himself down into a chair built for a second grader, with his knees somewhere up around his ears and his hands on his knees, and he sat there for 25 minutes, and he listened to every single word that woman said, and he did not interrupt her once. She told him that the girl was quiet. She told him the girl was watchful, and that watchful was not the same as shy, and she wanted him to know the difference. She told him the girl flinched at raised voices, and that this was not something to fix. It was something to be patient with. And then she told him the other thing. She said the child had a memory unlike anything she had seen in 22 years of teaching. Not just good, total. She said she could read a page to that little girl one time, out loud, at normal speed, and a week later the child could give it back to her word for word. Commas, pauses. The way the teacher's own voice had gone up at the end of a sentence. She said it the way you'd mention that a kid was tall, like a charming quirk, like a party trick. She had no idea. Nobody in that room had any idea. And Raymond Volkov, sitting in a plastic chair with his knees up by his ears, nodded slowly and said the only thing he said in the entire conference. He said, "She gets that from her mother." He had never met her mother. He had no earthly reason to believe that. He said it anyway. In the spring of 2010, an elementary school on the east side of Rockford held its 3rd grade spring recital in a multi-purpose room that smelled like floor wax and orange drink. And the back row filled up with Hell's Angels, 16 of them. I have this on the word of 4 separate people who were in that room, and none of them have ever gotten over it. 16 grown men in full colors, filing in through a door built for children, taking off their hats, sitting down in a row of folding chairs at the very back where they wouldn't block anybody's view. The room went silent. Of course it did. There were parents in that room who did not know whether to grab their children and leave. And the men sat down, and they folded their hands, and they did not say one word. For an hour and 10 minutes. Not one word. I don't know what she performed. I've never been able to find out, and honestly, I've stopped trying. Because it doesn't matter. And because I think there's something right about not knowing. Some kid's spring recital. Whatever it was probably not very good, because it was a room full of 8- and 9-year-olds, and none of them were very good, and every single one of their parents thought they were magnificent. And when it was over, when the whole room stood up and clapped the way people do, a man named Psalm looked down the row and saw that the man sitting 3 chairs away from him was crying, not making any noise about it, not wiping at it. Just sitting there, in his cut, with his hat in his hands, with tears going down into his beard, looking straight ahead at a stage full of ordinary children. That man was Cormac Reyes, the man who voted no. 16 Hell's Angels sat in the back row of a 3rd grade recital in Rockford, Illinois, and one of them cried. I want you to think for a second about who told you that people like that don't exist. Because somebody did. Somebody spent a great deal of energy, professional energy, career energy, funded energy, making absolutely certain you would never hear a story like this one. And in about 20 minutes, you are going to meet her. If you know somebody who's been written off, somebody the world already made up its mind about and never bothered to check, send them this. Not a clip of it, the whole thing. Let them sit in it. And in the comments, type back row if you'd have been sitting in it. That's all. Let's keep going. In March of 2013, a detective in the Rockford Police Department opened a file. His name was Brennan Cassidy Whitlock. He was 34 years old. He had a degree in criminal justice from a state school, and a commendation for a narcotics case, and a reputation, among the people who worked with him, for being the last man in the building every single night. He was not corrupt. I want to say that clearly, because it would be much easier if he were. And it isn't true. Nobody paid him. Nobody leaned on him. He didn't drink, he didn't gamble. He coached a youth baseball team on Saturdays, and he was, by every account I have found, a completely sincere man. He was worse than corrupt. He was certain. Brennan Whitlock had decided sometime early on what the truth was. And after that, every fact that came across his desk got sorted into one of two piles. The pile that confirmed it, and the pile that was somebody lying. There was no third pile. There had never been a third pile. And the terrible thing, the thing that makes this story what it is that he genuinely believed he was building a case, when what he was actually doing was building a frame, and then spending 8 years looking for things to hang in it. The file was labeled Volkov, R. It took him 6 years to fill. He was patient. God, he was patient. He was in no hurry at all. He pulled the Stateville jacket. He pulled 20-year-old arrest reports. He pulled surveillance from a federal task force that had been circling that charter since the 90s and had never made anything stick. He interviewed men who hated Raymond Volkov, and he wrote down every word they said. And he interviewed men who didn't, and he wrote down that they were uncooperative. And in 2014, he opened a subsection of that file, and he labeled it Known Associates. And in it, he put a 14-year-old girl. I have read the document. I want to be very precise about what it says, because precision is the whole point here. It is a standard intelligence summary, 2 pages, typed. It lists her school. It lists her grade. It lists the address of the brick house on the north side. And in the section marked Assessment, Detective Brennan Cassidy Whitlock, a man who coached youth baseball on Saturdays, described that child, in a police document, as a potential vector of influence. 6 words. He is not describing a suspect. She had never been arrested, never been questioned, never been accused of anything by anyone. He is describing a 14-year-old girl who got straight A's at a public school in Winnebago County. And he is describing her as a mechanism, as a lever, as something you could use. He looked at the single most extraordinary thing that ever happened in Raymond Volkov's life, and he could not see it. He was, I think, constitutionally unable to see it. Because if he saw it, if he let himself see it for even 1 second, the entire architecture of 6 years of work would have come down on his head. So he filed her. And he kept going. On the night of the 11th of August, 2019, a warehouse on the edge of Loves Park, Illinois, burned to the ground. It was a storage facility, half empty, the kind of building nobody thinks about until it's on fire. The blaze started in the northeast corner, sometime after 2 in the morning, and by the time the Loves Park Engine Company arrived, the roof was already gone. There was a night watchman inside. He was 61 years old. He had worked that building for 9 years. He had a wife and 2 grown sons and a grandson who was 3. And he did not make it out, and I am not going to describe how that happened, because his family is still alive and they have to live with it, and they do not need me making a story out of it. He died. That's the fact. A man went to work and he died. And somebody did it to him. And that is not a small thing, and I will not treat it like one. And 2 years later, on a Tuesday morning in March of 2021, federal agents arrested Raymond Volkov at his home on the north side of Rockford and charged him with ordering it. He was 66 years old. He came out with his hands behind his back, and he did not resist, and he did not say a word. Now here is what I need you to understand. and I need you to understand it clearly, because everything from this point forward depends on it. I am not going to tell you Raymond Volkov was innocent of everything. That would be a lie, and I told you at the start that I wasn't going to lie to you. He was not a good man in the way we usually mean that. He had done things. He had done 11 years for one of them, and he never once claimed he shouldn't have. I am going to tell you that he was innocent of this, and the distance between those two sentences, the space between he was not innocent and he did not do it, is the exact space in which an old man very nearly died in a federal cell. Because a system that cannot hold both of those thoughts at the same time is not a justice system. It's a sorting machine. And a sorting machine had been running on Raymond Volkov since 1977, and it had never once been wrong, and it was not about to start now. The evidence was a single sheet of paper. That's all. Everything else, 6 years of files, 20 years of surveillance, every hostile witness Brennan Whitlock could scrape out of 3 counties. None of it would have been enough. Prosecutors knew it. The defense knew it. It was a case made of smoke, except for the paper. It was a signed statement, 1 page. His name at the bottom in his own hand, in that heavy, blocky, back-slanted script that a man learns when he's taught to write by nuns, and then spends 11 years in a place where you write your letters slowly, because you have nothing else to do with the afternoon. And in it, Raymond Volkov accepted responsibility, not vaguely, not by implication. In plain language, he wrote that what happened had happened under his authority, that he did not dispute it, that he would answer for it, and that no other man should. 3 separate document examiners looked at it. 2 for the government, 1 for the defense. All 3 came back the same way. It was his handwriting. It was not a forgery. It was not traced. It was not copied. It was not machine-generated. Raymond Volkov, at some point, had physically sat down with a pen and written those words. And when his own lawyer put that page in front of him in a conference room at the federal courthouse and asked him, pleaded with him, to explain it, Grizz looked at it for a long moment, and he said, I didn't write that. That was it. That was the entire defense. I didn't write that, said by a man whose handwriting it demonstrably, provably, was. His lawyer asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. His lawyer asked him again the next week. He didn't answer. Psalm came to see him. Hugo Delacroix, road captain, 31 years, the one man alive who could tell Raymond Volkov the truth to his face, sat across a table from him and said, Ray, look at me. Whatever this is, whatever you think you're doing, it's going to kill you. And Grizz looked at him, and he said nothing at all. She was 22. She was in her final year of law school, and she had a scholarship, and she had an offer waiting from a firm in Chicago that would have paid her more in the first year than that entire clubhouse had made in a decade. She had done it. She had done the whole impossible thing, from a cardboard box behind a gas station to a corner desk in a law library, and she had done it in 15 years, and she had done it because a frightening man had stopped his motorcycle in the rain. She drove down to see him, and through the glass, an old man in a jumpsuit told his daughter to stay away from his trial. She argued. Of course she argued. She was 3 months from a law degree, and she'd been arguing with him since she was tall enough to reach the counter. And he said, and I have this from her, and she has said it publicly in a room full of people, so I can say it here. He said, if you walk into that courtroom, they will make you part of it. And then you'll be in the file too. And once you're in the file, you don't ever get out. And then he said, promise me. And she looked at the man who had gone into a public library in 2008 and checked out a book on how to braid hair because he was too proud and too frightened and too tender to ask a woman for help. And she promised. Now, you've been waiting a long time for one thing, and I've made you wait on purpose, and here it comes. He wouldn't explain the letter, not to his lawyer, not to Psalm, not to the girl. He sat in a federal detention facility at 66 years old, with 3 handwriting experts saying he wrote it, and a prosecutor building a life sentence out of it, and he would not say one word. Why? I told you at the very beginning that there was a thing he used to say. A joke, almost. A phrase the whole club used to shout back at him, because he said it so often nobody could remember a time before it. You don't leave what's yours out in the cold. He was protecting somebody. He was sitting in that cell, letting the state of Illinois take his last good years. because he was standing between somebody and the weather. And every single person in that courthouse was about to spend 11 days screaming past the answer. Her name was Delphine Okonjo-Brack. I've said it 3 times now. This is the 4th, and I've kept her off stage on purpose, because I wanted you to have exactly what that jury had: a name, a reputation, and nothing else, before she walked through the door. She was an assistant United States attorney for the Northern District of Illinois. She was 46. She had graduated near the top of her class from a very good school. She had turned down private practice twice, and she had a conviction record that people in her office spoke about the way people speak about a fastball. And she was not stupid, and she was not lazy, and she was not evil, and I need you to hold that. Because a villain who is stupid is not frightening. A villain who is stupid is a cartoon. What is frightening, what is actually frightening, is a brilliant, disciplined, sincerely motivated person who has decided, in advance, what kind of man you are. She had been given a case made of smoke and 1 sheet of paper, and she looked at that case, and she saw exactly one problem with it. The problem was the girl. She knew about Wren. Of course she knew. It was in the file. Whitlock had put her there himself, 7 years earlier, under known associates. And Delphine Okonjo-Brack sat in her office, and she understood something that Brennan Whitlock never understood in 8 years of work. She understood that if that young woman ever sat down in a witness chair in front of 12 ordinary people from Winnebago County, if she ever opened her mouth and told them what a man in a leather cut had done on a cold night in October of 2007, then the case was over. Not legally, emotionally. And she had been doing this long enough to know that in a room like that, emotionally is the only way anything is ever really over. So she did not try to keep the story out. She did something far more intelligent and far, far worse. She got there first. On the first morning of trial, standing in front of that jury, Delphine Okonjo-Brack told them she was going to tell them a story about a little girl. And then she said this, and I'm reading it because I don't trust myself to paraphrase it. She called it the longest and most successful grooming of public sympathy in the history of this district. She stood in a federal courtroom in the United States of America, and she told 12 people that when Raymond Volkov knelt down in 3 inches of freezing water behind a gas station on Kishwaukee Street and looked at a barefoot 8-year-old in a cardboard box, he was building an asset. She said the guardianship was a shield. She said the school records were camouflage. She said that a man with a criminal record had understood, in 2007, that someday he would need a sympathetic face in a courtroom, and that he had gone out and acquired one. She turned the single most beautiful thing that man ever did in his entire life into evidence of his guilt. I want you to sit with that for a second. I had to. I read that transcript for the first time on an ordinary afternoon, and I got to that sentence, and I put the pages down on the table, and I went outside and stood in my own driveway for about 10 minutes and looked at nothing. Because she looked at a man pulling a freezing child out of a cardboard box, and she called it strategy. Okay, pause. I'm going to ask you for something. Delphine Okonjo-Brack stood in a federal courtroom and told 12 people that saving a child's life was a tactic. She is going to lose. I'm telling you that right now, out loud, with 20 minutes left. She is going to lose, and I am going to show you exactly how. But she does not lose, because the system worked. The system did not work. The system worked perfectly, exactly as designed, and it was about to bury an innocent man. She loses because one person refused to be quiet. She broke her promise, not on the 11th day. That comes later. She broke it quietly, months before the trial started, in a law library, alone, at 2 in the morning, because Wren had said she wouldn't walk into that courtroom. She had not said she wouldn't work. Here is what everybody else did. The defense investigator went looking for an alibi. He spent 4 months and a lot of money trying to prove that Raymond Volkov was somewhere else on the night of the 11th of August, 2019, and he came back with nothing, because that's not how this works, and it never was. The prosecution wasn't claiming he lit the match. They were claiming he ordered it. You cannot alibi your way out of an order. Everybody was looking at the words on that page. Everybody was fighting about what he meant. 3 experts, 2 lawyers, a federal judge, 8 years of police work. All of them staring at the same 11 sentences and arguing about interpretation. And a 22-year-old law student in her final semester sat down with the discovery file at 2 in the morning, and she did not look at the words at all. She looked at the paper, and here is what she found. She found a single sheet, standard size, typed at the top with a handwritten body and a signature at the bottom. No date, that was the first thing. There was no date anywhere on that page, which is strange, for a confession, because the entire evidentiary value of a confession is when a man made it. But it had been treated as a fact of the document, an oddity, a thing to be worked around. And then she found the second thing. The text on that page did not begin at the beginning. Read it cold. And she read it 40, 50, 100 times. And the very first sentence continues something. It picks up. It refers back. It uses the word therefore. It is not the opening of a document. It is the middle of one. She pulled the evidence log. She read the seizure inventory from the 2019 search, the raid, the boxes, the property receipts, every page of it. And she cross-referenced it against something that nobody, in 8 years, had ever thought to check. Because everybody was asking, is this his handwriting? And she asked a different question. She asked, how many pages was this? It was 2. The document was 2 pages. It had always been 2 pages. The property receipt from the 2019 search, filled out, initialed, and filed by Detective Brennan Cassidy Whitlock, listed a 2-page handwritten document seized from a footlocker in the clubhouse on the south end of Rockford. Page 1 was not in the discovery file. Page 1 had never been in the discovery file. And when she finally got her hands on it, and I'll tell you exactly how she did that, but not yet, page 1 turned out to be a letter. It was written in the autumn of 2019. It was not written to the police. It was not written to a lawyer. It was not written to any court, in any jurisdiction, anywhere on this earth. It was written to the club. It was a resignation letter. Raymond Volkov was 64 years old and he was stepping down, retiring, handing off. And in that letter, in the formal, ceremonial, almost liturgical language that men in that world use for these things, language that goes back further than any of them, and that every single one of them understands the moment they hear it, he did what an outgoing officer does. He accepted command responsibility. Everything that happened under my patch. That's the phrase. That is a ritual phrase. It means I was in charge, and so whatever was done, it lands on me, and no man under me answers for it. It is a formality. It is a farewell. It is the closest thing that world has to a benediction. And page 2, the page with the therefore, was where he wrote out the terms. Take the second page away from the first, and it reads exactly like a confession to a murder. He didn't fabricate evidence. He just didn't turn the page over. That's it. That's all he did. That's the whole crime, and it is so small, and it destroyed so much. Brennan Cassidy Whitlock, who coached youth baseball on Saturdays, who never took a dollar, who was the last man in the building every single night, sat down with a 2-page document that he had seized with his own hands and initialed with his own pen. And he read page 1, which said that Raymond Volkov was quitting. And he read page 2, which, on its own, said that Raymond Volkov was guilty. And he had spent 8 years knowing exactly what kind of man Raymond Volkov was. So he filed one, and he entered the other. I have no doubt, none, that if you had asked him, he would have told you that page 1 was irrelevant. Immaterial, club business, not probative, and he would have believed it. That's what I meant. When I told you he was worse than corrupt, she had it. 22 years old in a law library at 2 in the morning, a young woman who had once owned 2 shirts and a broken hairbrush and a photograph had found the thing that could open a federal detention center and give an old man back the rest of his life. And there was exactly one problem. That letter meant nothing on its own. On its own, it was 11 sentences of strange, archaic language written by a felon, and any prosecutor alive would tear it apart in 90 seconds. To make it mean something, to prove to 12 people from Winnebago County that everything that happened under my patch was a farewell and not a confession, she needed a witness. She needed a living human being who had been in that room when it was written, who knew what it was, who could sit in that chair and say so under oath. There was one man alive who could do that. And it was the man who had stood up in a cinder block room in the autumn of 2007 and argued, for the better part of an hour, that she should be put back out on the street. The man who had built her a bookshelf and never admitted it. The man who had sat in the back row of a third-grade recital and cried, and he had not spoken one word to Raymond Volkov in 4 years. Cormac Reyes lived alone in a house in Machesney Park with a 2-car garage and only 1 car in it, and the other bay was a workshop, and it had been a workshop for 30 years. That's where she found him. On a Thursday afternoon in the fall of 2021, a 22-year-old law student in a borrowed coat walked up a cracked driveway and stood in the open mouth of a garage that smelled like sawdust and machine oil, and looked at a man in his 60s with his back to her, running a block plane down the edge of a board. He knew she was there. She could tell he knew. He didn't turn around, and she said the only thing she had come to say. She said, "I know about the letter. I know there were 2 pages, and I need you to tell me what page 1 meant." And Tin Reyes stopped planing. He stood there for a long time with his hands flat on the workbench and his head down, and the sawdust drifted through the light from the open door. And somewhere down the street, somebody started a lawnmower. And then he said, "And she has repeated this to me exactly, and she does not vary a word of it. Ever," he said. "He told me you'd figure it out. He told me you'd figure it out, and that when you did, I should tell you the truth, and that I should do it fast, because you'd already have worked out most of it, and I'd only insult you by lying." And then he turned around, and she saw that Cormac Reyes had been crying for a long time before she got there. He did it. That's the whole thing. I could dress it up, I could build it, I could make you wait, but you've waited 50 minutes and you deserve it flat. Cormac Tin Reyes ordered the fire at that warehouse in Loves Park on the 11th of August, 2019. Not Raymond Volkov. Tin. I'm not going to spend time on why. It doesn't matter, and it isn't interesting, and if I make it interesting, I'll be doing exactly what that prosecutor did. Turning a dead man into an argument. It was money. It was stupid. It was a business dispute in a dying industry in a dying town, and it was supposed to be an empty building. There was a night watchman inside. 61 years old. A wife. 2 sons. A grandson who was 3. Tin did not intend that. It happened anyway, and I want to be extremely clear here, because we are about to do something dangerous. We are about to feel sorry for the man who did it, and I am not going to let us do that without paying for it. A man died. He didn't have to. Somebody made a choice, and the choice killed him. And every single thing you are about to feel about Cormac Reyes has to be carried alongside that, forever, without ever setting it down. That's the price of this part of the story. Pay it. And Raymond Volkov took the fall. That's the letter. That's the whole letter. That's what he was doing in a cinder-block room in the autumn of 2019 with a pen in his hand, writing out 2 pages in that heavy back-slanted script, using words 100 years older than any man in that building. Everything that happened under my patch. He was 64 years old. He had a felony record from 1977. He had a conviction the length of your arm, and a reputation that had already decided what he was, in every courthouse in the state, before he ever walked into one. And Cormac Reyes had a daughter. She was 19. She was in her 2nd year at a community college in Rockford, and she worked at a pharmacy on the weekends. And this is the part that undoes me, she had never once been inside that clubhouse. Not one time, because her father would not allow it. Grizz did the arithmetic. It's ugly arithmetic, and he did it in about 90 seconds, standing in a room with a man who had just told him what he'd done. And it went like this. One of us is going to answer for this. If it's you, your girl watches you go. And she's 19, and she'll carry it her whole life. If it's me, I'm 64. I've already done 11. I've got a bad heart and a worse record, and nobody in this state has believed a word out of my mouth since I was 22 years old. I have less to lose. So it's me. 15 years earlier, in that same building, Hugo Delacroix stood up in a room full of men who wanted a little girl put back out on the street, and he threw Raymond Volkov's own words back into his face. You don't leave what's yours out in the cold. And Grizz said, she ain't mine. And he was lying then too. Because that was never a rule about the girl. It was never a rule about tools left out in the yard or bikes left in the rain or any of the small stupid things that Clubhouse laughed about for 20 years. It was a rule about everybody. It was the only rule he had. It was the only thing he'd ever believed. He said it out loud so many times that it stopped being a sentence and became a sound. And not one man in that room, not one, in 20 years, ever stopped to hear what it actually was. He was never a man who made one exception for one child. He was a man who was always going to do this. And it was always going to cost him everything. So now she had it, all of it. A 22-year-old with a scholarship and a job offer in Chicago had, in the space of about 4 months, done what a federal defense team could not do in a year. And she was standing in the mouth of a garage in McChesney Park, holding the confession of the man who actually did it. To save the man who raised her, all she had to do was destroy Cormac Reyes, the man who voted no, the man who built her a bookshelf out of solid oak and sanded it so smooth you couldn't find a splinter, and looked her father in the eye and said he had no idea where it came from. The man who sat in the back row of a school recital in a folding chair with his hat in his hands and cried where nobody was supposed to see him. The man with a 19-year-old daughter. She did not decide that day. She drove instead to a diner on Kishwaukee Street. There is a place across the road from that marathon station. A low brick building with a hand-painted sign, 4 booths, 8 stools, and a woman who has been standing behind that counter since 1971. Her name is Pearline Stubbs. She was 84 years old in 2021, and she is a woman who has watched an entire American city die through a plate glass window while pouring coffee, and she has opinions about it, and she will share them. Wren went there because it was the closest building to that dumpster. That was the whole reason. Cold, plain investigative logic. Somebody was standing near that lot on that night in 2007, and this is the only place they could have been standing. She sat down at the counter, and she said she was looking for anybody who might remember a night in October of 2007. And Pearline Stubbs looked at her for about 4 seconds. And she said, "Honey, I've been waiting 15 years for you to come in here." She went in the back. She was gone maybe 2 minutes, and she came out with a shoebox. It had been on a shelf in a storeroom behind a diner on Kishwaukee Street since the autumn of 2007. 15 years. Through 2 roof repairs and a flood in the basement and a heart attack and a hip replacement, and Pearline Stubbs had never once thrown it out, because, and this is exactly what she said, it wasn't mine to throw out. Inside it was a black plastic garbage bag, 2 shirts, folded, a hairbrush with a broken handle, snapped clean off, and a photograph. Grizz had come back that night, of course he had. After he'd taken her home, after he'd put her in a spare room with no bookshelf in it yet, he'd gone back to that lot at 1 in the morning and picked up everything she'd left behind, and he'd walked across the road and put it in the hands of the only person still awake on Kishwaukee Street, and he'd said, "Hold this. Don't throw it out, it's hers." And then he never came back for it, because he could not bring himself to give it to her. He could not bring himself to hand a little girl the bag she'd been living out of. Not that year. Not the next one. Not any year after that. You don't leave what's yours out in the cold. He'd said it about a garbage bag. She took the photograph out. It was creased through the middle in a deep white line, worn so thin from being held that the face at the center of it was almost gone. It was a picture of 2 women standing outside a school. One of them was her mother, and standing beside her, in a nurse's uniform, small, laughing at something outside the frame, was Nadia Volkov. Nadia Volkov was a school nurse in the Rockford district for 19 years. I told you that. I told you that once, 46 minutes ago, and then I moved on, because that is exactly how she would have wanted it told. For 2 years, 2 years before she died, 2 years before Raymond Volkov ever knew that child existed, Nadia Volkov had been quietly making sure that a certain little girl in that district ate lunch, out of her own pocket, every day. She never filed it. She never claimed it. She never once told her husband in a marriage of 26 years that she was doing it. And I have thought about that a great deal, and I have come to believe she didn't tell him because she didn't think it was worth mentioning. She just did it. And then she got sick. And then she died. And 4 years later, on a night when the temperature was 41 degrees, a woman who was dying and homeless and out of every option a person can be out of said one thing to her daughter. She said, "Find the nurse's husband. He's the one who'll come." She gave her the photograph. And that little girl held it so hard, for so long, that she nearly rubbed her own mother's face off of it. And she went to the only place she knew, the road outside the school where the picture was taken, and she waited. And a 280-pound man in a leather cut came out of the dark and crouched down in front of her, and she looked up at him, and she did not run, because she had been told he was coming. He never knew. I want to say that as plainly as I can. Raymond Volkov did not know. He looked at that photograph for 4 seconds in the rain in October of 2007, and he saw his dead wife's face, and he had no earthly idea why it was in a child's hand, and he never found out, and he never asked. He just said yes. Raymond Volkov thought he was the beginning of that story. He was the end of it. His wife started it 4 years before he ever knew that little girl existed, and she never lived to see him finish it. On the 11th day of the trial, the back doors of a federal courtroom in Rockford, Illinois opened. The prosecution had rested. The defense was down to nothing. And Delphine Okonjo-Brack had already won. She knew it, the judge knew it, and the 12 people in that box had known it for about 4 days. And a young woman walked down the center aisle. Nobody knew who she was. Not the jury, not the bailiff, not Delphine Okonjo-Brack, who had built a career on being the most prepared person in any room. And Raymond Volkov, 67 years old, in a suit that didn't fit, a man who had sat through 11 days of trial without moving his face one single time, stood up. He stood up at the defense table and he said no, out loud, in open court. He said no, don't, and his lawyer grabbed his arm, and the judge told him to sit down, and he did not sit down. And Judge Orrin Halverson, 74 years old, 31 years on that bench, told him a second time, and he sat. And then that terrifying old man put his face in his hands and he wept, in front of 12 strangers, and a federal judge, and a woman who had called him a monster in her opening statement, because he knew who she was, and he knew what she was about to give up to do this. Delphine Okonjo-Brack objected before she reached the stand. Relevance, prejudice, improper character evidence. Judge Halverson looked at that young woman for a long moment, and he said, overruled. Let's hear it. And she did not present the letter. That's the thing. Everybody in that room, the defense, the prosecution, everybody, expected paper. That is what lawyers do. You put the document in front of the jury and you argue about it. She didn't. She stood in that witness box and she asked the court's permission to recite something from memory, and then she gave them page 1. Every word of it. She had read it exactly once. 4 years earlier, she was 19 years old, standing in her father's kitchen, and she picked up 2 sheets of paper off the counter and read them, and he came in and took them out of her hands and never spoke of it again. Once. And she stood in a federal courtroom 4 years later and gave it back. The whole thing, that strange archaic language, the ritual phrasing, the farewell, in a flat, clear voice, without a single pause, from the first line to the last. Her 3rd grade teacher had put it in a file in 2008. She'd called it a charming quirk, and when Wren was done, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the radiator. Then she produced the original page 1. Then, the affidavit of Pearline Stubbs, 84 years old, of Kishwaukee Street. And then the back doors opened a second time. Nobody subpoenaed Cormac Reyes. She never had to make that choice. She never had to destroy him. She had gone home from that garage in McChesney Park and sat up all night with the worst decision of her life in her hands. And she never got to make it, because he walked in on his own. He walked down that center aisle in a clean shirt with his hands empty, and he asked to be sworn. And he told the United States government what he had done. And when they asked him why he was doing it, why now, after 4 years, after all of it, Cormac Reyes said, because you don't leave what's yours out in the cold. 20 years of that clubhouse making fun of a man for saying it, and it turns out every single one of them had been listening. Delphine Okonjo-Brack had one question on cross. One. She stood up, and she looked at that young woman, and she asked, isn't it true that this man is not, and has never been your father? And Wren said, ma'am, I was 8 years old. It was 41 degrees, and nobody in this room came for me. He did. You can call that whatever you want. I've only ever had one word for it. Not guilty. On all counts. 4 hours. Brennan Cassidy Whitlock was referred for review over the missing page. He resigned before it concluded. He has never admitted to anyone that he did anything wrong, and I believe completely that he still thinks he didn't. Delphine Okonjo-Brack was not fired. She was not disciplined. She lost a case, and she went back to her office, and she is still trying cases today, and she has never said one public word about any of this. I know that's unsatisfying, I know, but I told you I wouldn't lie to you. Cormac Reyes went to prison, and he will die there, and he knew that when he walked through those doors. He asked Ren for exactly one thing. Look in on my girl. She does, every month, for 5 years now. And on a Thursday afternoon, Raymond Volkov walked out of that courthouse at 67 years old into a parking lot full of men in leather, and in the bed of a pickup truck, standing upright, tied down with rope, was a bookshelf, solid oak, 6 shelves, hand-planed, sanded so smooth you couldn't find a splinter on it if you dragged your palm across the whole thing. Cormac Reyes had asked them to bring it. She's a public defender now. She could have had Chicago. She turned it down. She works one kind of case, people the system already made up its mind about. He still sets out 2 cups every morning, one for the woman who started it, and one for the girl who finished it. He says he isn't sure anymore which one is which. He says it doesn't matter. Delphine Okonjo-Brack called it a strategy. Brennan Whitlock called it a known association. The file called it supervised guardianship, subject to review. Raymond Volkov never called it anything at all. He just stopped the car. If you made it all the way to the end of this, 60 minutes, no skipping, then you're the kind of person who was always going to be sitting in that back row. Subscribe. Not for me. For the next one. There are more of these, and nobody is telling them. And in the comments, I want one thing. Who stopped the car for you? I read every single one.